Yes, Mr. Hill.
Mr. Macniven, the next period that I would like to take you to is 1987, March and April of that year. On the 3rd of March 1987, the SNBTS directors met. It was a meeting attended by Dr. Forrester, and the directors agreed to recommend the implementation of surrogate testing in Scotland from the 1st of April 1988. The reference for those who need it is PRSE 304163. The SNBTS directors also included a further bid in the PES process in 1987 at lower levels this time, £300,000 for year one and £105,000 for year two, and that's at Penrose 27.180. So SNBTS still pushing for the introduction of surrogate testing at a corporate level. If I could take you to a document which is from the 6th of April 1987, it's PRSE 40618. This is a minute from Dr. McIntyre. So to remind everybody, the principal medical officer, one tier up on Dr. Forrester. And he produced a minute which was sent to Dr. Scott, the deputy chief medical officer, Dr. Muir, Mr. Morrison, your boss, to you, to Sandy Murray, and to Dr. Forrester. It is entitled Scottish Participation in UK Research Project on Transfusion-Associated Non-A, Non-B Hepatitis. The first 3 paragraphs set out some background about non-A, non-B hepatitis and surrogate testing, and the introduction of surrogate testing in the USA, which Dr. McIntyre says he largely suspects is the result of a fear of litigation. What he then goes on to say in the second paragraph from the bottom, starting SHHD was asked, is this. SHHD was asked last year to meet the expenditure of £810,000 annually to establish screening of all blood donations with the intention of reducing transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis by blood and blood products. Approval was not given as the research already conducted in the west of Scotland with CSO funding indicated that the impact there of transfusion-associated non-A, non-B hepatitis was not great. I just pause there to note that's a reference, is it not, to Dr. Dowell's research, and CSO funding is funding from the chief central scientific office?
No, chief scientific office. Yes, that's correct. It's a reference to Dr. Dow's research. The significance of that was that this, I think, is that this is a request for further chief scientist office funding, and Archie McIntyre brings out the point that Dr. Dow's work was carried out with CSO funding. Just to explain a reference at the top of the page, if you could page up a little to the top of the page, you see the appearance of Dr. Moyer among the addressees. Now, Dr. Moyer hasn't appeared in our dramatis personae so far, and he was the director of the department's chief scientist office. And it was the Chief Scientist Office that held the budget for research. So Dr. Moyer was essentially the manager of the research budget and other functions, but that's his relevance there.
And perhaps relevant as well, but he's featuring prominently on this list of people to whom
yes, probably.
If we could just go back, thank you for that. If we could go back to the penultimate paragraph. So Dr. McIntyre has referred to Dr. Dowell's research, and then he also says, also that the indirect screening proposed would be expensive, could not in any event abolish the transmission of this hepatitis by blood and blood products, and would lead to a loss of perceptible amount of innocent blood, which nevertheless failed to pass the screen. We also wish to await DHSS thinking on this subject. DHSS have now invited their transfusion-associated hepatitis working party, which includes 2 Scottish members and an SHHD observer, to consider this issue. The working party noted the research already conducted in the west of Scotland and advised that instead of embarking at once on expenditure amounting the UK to perhaps £6 to £8 million,
that must be once off, I would imagine, rather than once on. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, my misreading. Apologise. Sorry, Matt. Sorry, Mr. Hill.
No problem. It's I think there is a word missing there, which is instead of embarking at once on expenditure amounting I think is probably the word missing, amounting in the UK to perhaps 6 to 8 million. So that's a figure for the whole of the UK and not just for Scotland. Research should be commissioned to expand the previous Scottish research. It is agreed that the impact of this hepatitis differs considerably in different countries. The research is planned to take place in 3 English centres and 1 Scottish centre, Edinburgh. The English component has been presented to the Research Management Division of DHSS. Formal application has been encouraged and is now being prepared with a view to start in September 1987. The directors of SNBTS are unanimous and are now pressing fairly strongly that this screening should be instituted. They're perfectly aware that it would be costly and could not abolish transmission completely. They could then claim to have taken all steps open to them to reduce transmission. Before embarking on such an expensive programme, it would seem logical to participate in the proposed research and to delay any further action until the results of this were known. That's Dr. McIntyre's minute and his view. If we could just go back to the front page, we can see some marginalia there, which is from Mr. Morrison, your boss. The marginalia says, Mr. Macniven, advice please. My initial reaction is it would not make sense to screen all blood for non-A, non-B, as benefits appear out of all proportion to the risks. We should therefore participate in the research. C, CSO should be encouraged to fund it. And if we look at 2 replies to this minute, the first comes from Dr. Scott, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. That's at PRSE 302916. Sent to Dr. McIntyre, copied to Dr. Moyer, as you said earlier, and the other addressees of the previous minute. Dr. Scott, on the 7th of April 1987, wrote this: I agree in principle with the procedure outlined in your minute of the 6th of April. We must do whatever we can to prevent the BTS going ahead with a full-scale introduction of this testing, or at least trying to blackmail us into the provision of funds. A research proposal from Edinburgh will, of course, have to be subject to the scrutiny of the appropriate CSO group and the availability of finance. I would not like to see it fail on the grounds of finance because the stakes are high. Your response in a minute dated the 9th of April 1987 is at PRSE 40784. Thank you, Lawrence. And this says, to address to Dr. McIntyre, thank you for your minute of the 6th of April. I'm replying on my own behalf and that of Mr. Morrison. Mr. Murray of my division is not in a position to reply since he's on sick leave. Mr. Morrison and I entirely agree with Dr. Scott's comments in his minute of the 7th of April to you. It is important that the decision on whether or not to screen all blood for non-A, non-B hepatitis, which will not be cheap and may not be certain, should be taken on the basis of the sort of UK research you suggest. That is the 9th of April 1987. We can see from those documents, thank you, Lawrence, for that committee taking them down. There is a clear consensus, is there not, between you, Dr. McIntyre, Dr. Scott, Mr. Morrison, that the cost-benefit analysis is clearly against testing, and also a consensus that you want to encourage further research. Is that a fair summary?
fair insofar as it goes, it's not simply a question of cost effectiveness, though.
What else was?
Well, if you could bring up the document, I think Dr. Scott's comments again, please.
PRSE 302916, please. Lord.
There was something about "and may not be effective." There's the question. Yes, he deals with funds. It was maybe in Archie McIntyre's note.
Yes.
Something to the effect of it would be costly and may not be effective. It's not just a question of cost, is my point. It's also a doubt, which we alluded to before lunch, about whether the surrogate testing would be sufficiently good to be helpful.
Could we have up on screen, please, Lawrence, PRSE 40618. This is Dr. McIntyre's original notes.
Yes, I'm sorry to get you to go back to an old document.
No problem at all. The penultimate paragraph starting SHHD was asked. And as we've seen, it refers...
Yes. Also that the indirect screening proposed would be expensive, yes, the question of cost, could not in any event abolish the transmission of this hepatitis by blood and blood products, and would lead to a loss of a perceptible amount of innocent blood, which nevertheless failed to pass the screen. It is not simply a question of cost.
The wording used there by Dr. McIntyre is could not in any event abolish. Now, what might be said about that is that is setting the bar too high, and that surrogate testing would not abolish, and nobody would claim that it would, but it would do some good. Did you, and to the best of your knowledge, accept the point that it would do something to reduce the incidence of non-A, non-B?
I can't remember contemporaneously, but among the multitude of papers that you've provided me with on the subject, there's one that says it would be about 40% ineffective. It would the false negatives, i.e., infected people who were not triggered by the surrogate testing, was in the region of 40%. So it was seriously, it would fail to abolish the transmission by quite a margin, according to the written evidence, the documents that you've supplied. I don't remember contemporaneously, though, how much these different factors weighed in the judgment we took. But all these factors were interwoven. And another one, which Archie doesn't mention in this email, this minute, is that it would create a difficulty in relation to donors who falsely tested positive, and who would therefore have to be counselled that they had or might have had a disease which was non-A, non-B hepatitis, which was a bit mysterious, but could in some circumstances be serious.
But that is certainly an argument which is raised in other papers, but as you say, not by Dr. McIntyre in this relatively short minute.
Yes, indeed. I don't think Archie McIntyre was intending to give a full treatise on the subject. The purpose of his note was to persuade Boyd Moyer to unlock the money.
And this question of seeking for research, was that a genuine concern for additional data to inform the decision, or was it a way of kicking this issue into the long run?
No, I think it was a genuine concern, which was shared by, for example, at an earlier stage, Brian McClelland. Now, it could, of the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service, one of the regional directors. Now, it could be said that this hour in the day was too late to launch such research. But at the time, one didn't know what hour of the day it was. It was only a couple of years before hepatitis C was identified, but one couldn't at this stage be certain that it was as short a period as that. So the research evidence could still be useful.
I think it's relevant to note so that others can follow it if they wish to, but in chapter 27 of Lord Penrose's report, he talks about other research projects that were going on in Europe at that time. Dr. Scott's contribution, with which you and Mr. Morrison expressed your agreement, is expressed in some fairly stark terms. We must do whatever we can to prevent the BTS going ahead, and also a reference to them blackmailing the SHHD. It may be submitted to the chair in due course, but that is perhaps indicative of an approach from the SHHD which has slipped from being merely determined to being dogmatic in its opposition to surrogate testing and the SNBTS's proposals. What would you say if that were a proposition that were put to the chair?
Yes, it is a fairly dogmatic statement. I think it was fed by an impatience by Dr. Scott, on the part of Dr. Scott, with the tactics of the SNBTS. It does not speak to his root and branch opposition to any form of surrogate testing, hence the research which he is supporting.
Were you and your colleagues still listening to the arguments at that stage?
Absolutely. We continued to listen to the arguments throughout. We kept revisiting this question, my memory is, over quite a long period. Our mind was not closed because for instance, because the SNBTS was still advocating surrogate testing.
There followed a series of letters in the Lancet, not obviously in response to this minute and this proposal, but just in coincidence of time. I'm not going to go through all of them, but for the record, on the 18th of April 1987, there was a letter in the Lancet opposing surrogate testing without further research, which came from Dr. Catherine Anderson and others at the North London Blood Transfusion Centre. On the 2nd of June 1987, another letter from other doctors at the same centre, again opposing the introduction of surrogate testing without further research and prospective trials in particular. And then on the 13th of June 1987, a letter sent by Dr. Dow, Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Follett from Glasgow expressing scepticism about surrogate testing and reporting Dr. Dow's thesis. And separately in the same edition, a letter from Dr. Gillen and colleagues at Edinburgh concluding that surrogate testing could not at that time be justified. Then, on the 4th of July 1987, there is a letter in support of surrogate testing which is sent on behalf of the directors of the SNBTS. And if we could have that on screen, please. PRSE 301444. If we just go to the second page, we can see the signatories in the second column, top of the second column. You can see that it's signed by Dr. McClellan, Dr. Clash, Dr. Aniak, Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Brooks, Dr. Perry, and Dr. Withrow. Then if we go back, please, to the first page, I'm going to read through this, and then I'm going to ask you to comment on the arguments that were raised in this letter in support of surrogate testing, noting the context that there have been other letters to the Lancet which opposed the introduction of surrogate testing, at least without further research. The letter is entitled Testing Blood Donors for Non-A, Non-B Hepatitis. Irrational, perhaps, but inescapable. Sir, in 3 letters in the Lancet, Dr. Anderson, Dr. Gillen and Dr. Dow and their colleagues point out weaknesses in the arguments which have been used to support the introduction of blood donor screening to reduce transmission, reduce transfusion-transmitted non-A, non-B hepatitis using alanine aminotransferase, ALT, and hepatitis B core antibody as surrogate markers. All 3 letters suggest that the UK Transfusion Services should not start donor screening until prospective controlled studies have been done in the UK to find out how many cases of post-transfusion hepatitis would be prevented. No large study to answer this critical question has yet been presented, and we agree that the size of the benefit to be gained from surrogate testing cannot be accurately established without such a study. However, the time for this study has already passed. Starting now will give us an answer in 3 to 4 years, and that is probably 3 to 4 years too late. The introduction of surrogate marker testing for NANB-H is now virtually inescapable for 3 reasons. 1. In 1988, European legislation on strict proof liability comes into force in the UK. Pause to note that's a reference to the Consumer Protection Act. If harm should come to the recipient of a therapeutic product, the producer will be held liable unless he can demonstrate that he has used all known methods and information to avoid the risk. Under these rules, a patient who contracted NANB hepatitis via transfusion of blood or a blood product would have a claim against the supplier if it was shown to come from a donor who had not been tested for both raised ALT and anti-HBC. 2. Although we all hope that pooled plasma fractions will soon be made safe by heating or other antiviral treatment, these processes remain to be validated in large-scale trials. Meantime, even if surrogate marker screening would only modestly reduce the level of infectivity of these products, many would argue that some improvement is better than none. 3. The UK Transfusion Services, although the major suppliers of blood and blood products in this country, cannot afford to ignore the wishes of consumers to be supplied with non-A, non-B tested products, even if it is believed that the real benefit and safety which is offered to the patients is marginal. Commercial suppliers will not be slow to point out that their products are made from tested plasma and must therefore be safer. Clinicians and patients can hardly be blamed for taking note of this message. And this argument may be applied equally to whole blood, red blood cells, platelets, and plasma. What better marketing ploy for a private blood bank than to emphasise that its donors are tested to exclude hepatitis using the standard supplied in the United States, Germany, and France? The local NHS blood supplier will have trouble shrugging off accusations of providing a second-class product. It is also worth taking a second look at the assumption that surrogate marker testing is necessarily a bad buy in comparison with the tests that are accepted as essential to prevent other transfusion-transmitted infections. Table 1 shows a calculation to illustrate the cost of surrogate testing to prevent 1 case of cirrhosis due to transfusion-transmitted non-A, non-B hepatitis. This should be compared with the cost of HIV antibody testing to prevent 1 case of transfusion-transmitted AIDS. Alternatively, one could compare the costs of the present practice of routinely HB testing all repeated blood donors, in whom the prevalence of infection is predictably very low. Table 2 shows how these testing costs relate to the gains in patient safety. These calculations suggest that even if the underlying assumptions are varied quite widely, the cost of preventing morbidity by surrogate marker testing for NANB may be no greater and be less than those which are accepted for established screening programs. Looking at these 3 factors, producers' liability, competition, and value for money, we suggest that the decision which has to be made is when, rather than whether, the UK Transfusion Services follow the lead of the United States and other European countries in donor screening. We've already referred to the signatories, and I'm not intending to go through the tables showing the cost-benefit analysis that is being put forward in this paper. If we could take that off the screen, please, Lawrence. I'd like you to address, if you would, the arguments that are put forward. My screen has frozen with the document on there. I don't know if everybody can still hear me.
Yes, I can still hear you fine.
Thank you. So the arguments that are put forward, the first one is about the Consumer Protection Act and the risk of legislation. Now, in your view, was that a valid argument for the SNBTS directors to be raising?
I can't now remember, all these years later, what I thought about reading a Lancet article. I would observe that we today have the benefit of hindsight. And with the benefit of hindsight, the very knowledgeable and well-intentioned signatories of that letter were simply wrong.
They were wrong about what?
They were wrong on at least 2 of the 3 counts that they gave. First, they said that it was inevitable that it would be introduced. It was not inevitable. It was not introduced either in England or in Scotland. The first of their arguments was that it was related to product liability and the fear of claims against the blood transfusion service, which could have been avoided by the introduction of testing. Now, it may be that my information is incomplete, but I recollect in my time no cases of that kind. Their third, we've already dealt with discussed their second argument. Their third argument was that the market would shift away from the protein fractionation center product towards commercially produced product, which, although not necessarily safer and arguably more dangerous, had the gold seal of surrogate testing. That did not happen. Indeed, we may come on later this afternoon to the fact that the clinicians in Scotland were deploring the fact that that we were no longer self-sufficient in blood products. They were complaining about their inability to prescribe freely the very product which this letter to the Lancet suggests that they would regard as anathema.
Let's just go through the arguments one by one there and come on to how, or look at them through the lens at the time rather than retrospective.
I fear that I can't do that. My recollection of reaction at the time is insufficiently great to deal with the level of detail in these in the article.
Very well. We've discussed, as you say, the argument that some improvement is better than none. Product liability, I won't go into a discussion of what litigation was or was not brought, but would you accept that it was a legitimate concern for the directors of the SNBTS to be sure that they were, or to seek to ensure that they were acting in a way that was compliant with recently passed legislation?
The question of product liability was very complicated, and my recollection is that the SNBTS directors did not fully understand it. We had long conversations with Graham Calder, the department's chief pharmacist, who was the expert, the Scottish expert on the subject of product liability, which I think allayed their fears about product liability, fears which were not uncalled for the reason you give, but were not well founded.
The comparison that they present with HIV and HBV, now I'm not going to look at those specific figures, and the Penrose report does contain some discussion of the assumptions that lie behind them. Was that an argument that you were aware was being made at the time? We're testing for HIV, we're testing for HBV, we should be testing for NAMB.
I can't recollect. I can't recollect.
And the final argument that was made is that this testing had been introduced in West Germany, in France, and in the United States. Now, leaving aside quite why it was introduced in each of those countries, was that an argument that was at least worthy of consideration, that these advanced Western democracies were putting in place such testing, so we should at least be thinking about it?
Yes, and we were indeed thinking about it. Bear in mind that the nature of the health service in the States and its propensity to litigate, or patients' propensity to litigate, was completely different from the UK scene. And bear in mind, too, that these are three countries, all, as you say, Western democracies. The letter understandably did not list the other Western democracies, including the UK, the rest of the UK, which had not introduced surrogate testing.
One final document before some final questions on surrogate testing. PRSE 303515, please. This is a minute that you wrote on the 2nd of October 1987. It is sent to Dr. Forrester and copied to Dr. McIntyre and to Dr. Forbes of the Chief Scientist's Office. SNBTS screening donations for non-A, non-B hepatitis. And it refers to a minute that was sent to you 1st of October. It says, your final paragraph concerns timing. The PES timetable really requires us to reach a decision very soon on whether to earmark funds for the SNBTS for this purpose. I have, however, taken steps to get round this problem by registering with the Finance Division that a need for non-A, non-B testing may emerge, but, and this is the key point, it would be premature to allocate money to the SNBTS for the purpose at the moment. But I'm a little anxious about the timescale implied by your minute. I'm very anxious indeed for our decision on whether or not to put resources into NAMB testing should be properly informed by research evidence. If that evidence justifies testing, then it is very important that we should be able to find money to start it quickly. If it does not justify testing, it is equally important that we should not have allocated money to the SNBTS for the purpose, thereby sterilising it for other uses. But I think the worst of all possible worlds is that the research cannot get off the ground. I fear that in those circumstances, we would be subjected to increasingly irresistible pressure to spend the money in any case for the sake of improving at any price the safety of blood and blood products. A couple of things to pick up from there. Firstly is the question of the acute need to sort out the funding bids for the PES round. And it appears from this minute that you had resolved that problem by talking to the Finance Division and
up to a point. I had kept the possibility open, but that possibility could not be kept open indefinitely because in the end, Finance Division would have to set budgets.
Would you have consulted with others within the HHD before taking those steps?
I would have done. I don't recall having done so, but it's inconceivable that I wouldn't have done.
The second point about research, the wording that you use there seems to hold open the possibility that research might show that surrogate testing.
Oh, yes.
Yes. That was something that was still in your mind at that time.
Say that again, sorry?
that was something that was still in your mind.
Oh, yes. I mean, an interesting thing about this minute, could you page down a little so that I can see its date? Yes, October 87.
October 9th.
The paragraph 1 and the paragraph you've just quoted from both demonstrate, I think, that our minds were open. My mind was open, but I was expressing here the collective thoughts, the unanimous thoughts that I've already spoken about of me and my colleagues, that, let me quote it, if that evidence justifies testing. Our mind was open, and I was guarding against the possibility that the answer was, you've got to introduce it, and our pockets were empty. And it would have been quite unreasonable to expect the SNBTS to start testing without some form of subvention for the purpose. So this is an example. It's helpful that you've thrown it up. That gives that demonstrates that it would be wrong to allege, as you seem to be coming close to alleging before lunch, that the departmental mind, having been made up, was never going to change. That was not the way that we operated.
I'm making no allegations. I'm putting propositions to you so that you have an opportunity to...
Very well. You were proposing that that was the case.
I was putting the proposition so that you had an opportunity to respond to it.
Well, it's useful to have evidence in support of the answer I then gave.
By this stage, there is no evidence that I've seen, and I don't think you've seen any evidence either, that the issue had gone to a minister.
Correct. I don't think, as we've said before, I don't think it ever did.
By October 1987, you have 2 PES rounds in which the SNBTS have made a bid for this. You have a seeming stark disagreement between the directors, and I stress the directors of the SNBTS and the SHHD about the issue. And that has been ventilated in the Lancet, at least the SNBTS director's view has been ventilated in the Lancet. And again, I note that other clinicians disagreed with them. But
other clinicians within the organisation disagreed with them, yes. I wonder whether it's right to call them clinicians. Other people within the organisation, clinicians has a specificity of definition that I'm not sure whether they meet or not. But anyway, experts within the organisation would have different views.
I completely accept that correction. The question that arises, therefore, is where there is this difference in view about, in essence, the benefits that may be brought against the costs that may be incurred. Why was it that a minister was not asked to judge whether or not that was worth the candle?
I don't know that I've got anything further to add to what I said this morning. In general, it was a very difficult call as to whether a matter was put up to a minister for decision or not. B, specifically on this issue, we regarded despite what you say about the difference of opinion within the BTS, we didn't regard the issue as being sufficiently open to put to ministers. I deduce, I don't recollect this, but I deduce from the papers that you've provided to me.
Do you remember there ever being a discussion amongst yourselves about whether or not this did need to go to a minister?
There must have been, but I don't recall it, and the papers that you've kindly provided don't illuminate the matter. But there must have been, because, as I say, it was always a difficult question about when to involve ministers, or whether to involve ministers. We've clearly, over quite a period, repeatedly decided that the time was not right to involve ministers.
Just so that we complete the chronology, it appears that after the autumn of 1987, some of the heat went out of the issue. The SMBTS directors set up a Scottish research project. There's a convoluted story about which research projects got off the ground, but I don't think we need to trouble you. And there was also, in April 1988, agreement from the SMBTS directors not to introduce surrogate testing in Scotland unless and until it became UK policy. And then the following month, May 1988, you have the announcement from Chiron, the American firm, that they had identified what became known as the Hepatitis C virus.
Might I come back to a point that these remarks remind me of? Going back to the question of how much weight did we put on the SNBTS director's letter to the Lancet vis-a-vis the letters from their staff. The directors were never saying, as far as I can recollect, and they were certainly not saying in the Lancet letter, remember what its headline was, they were not saying surrogate testing is scientifically medically necessary. They were saying, despite the paucity of scientific medical evidence, which is what their subordinates were concerned with, despite the lack of, or the paucity of that evidence, it is inevitable. We will be pressurized into it, not because we think it's good, but because we have come under irresistible pressure. And I think a part of what was in the department's mind would have been that we were in as good a position as they were to evaluate the strength of that pressure. I think I think it would be wrong to crack up a difference, as you and I may have been slightly guilty of doing a moment ago, a difference of scientific opinion between the chiefs in the SNBTS and the expert Indians, if one's allowed to use chiefs and Indians these days. Well, I'll find a synonym. The senior folk in the SNBTS and their more junior but expert colleagues, I don't think that there was such a scientific difference of opinion. It was a difference of opinion on that issue which I mentioned a moment ago, which I've come back to, which is that how great is the pressure on us to introduce it despite the lack of scientific evidence. And for that reason, you could imagine that the senior folk could take a different view in a way that it wasn't really open. Their more junior colleagues, however expert, didn't have the world view that kind of judgment required. My point is that I do not think there was a difference of scientific opinion within the SNBTS in the way that you and I were a moment ago sort of feeling our way towards.
So does it follow then that there would have been less deference from the non-specialists in the SHHD on a question which was one, as you say, of policy and a discussion and costs and benefits than there would have been if it had been a matter of pure science?
My recollection doesn't illuminate it, but that's my deduction from the information, from the written information that you've provided.
Do you have any memory now about why it is that the issue does seem to fade away from the autumn of 1980.
Yes, I don't have a contemporary recollection, but linked to what I've just said, I think the chiefs in the SNBTS had perhaps become more confident that pressure would not reach an irresistible level. International pressure, commercial pressure would not reach an irresistible level.
That is something that you are inferring now from the documents you've seen.
Correct. It would be very interesting to ask Brian McClelland whether that hypothesis is correct. But I reach it on the basis of the contemporary documents that you've provided.
We also see in April 1989 the creation of the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood as a UK-wide body.
Yes.
And we're getting very close at the end of your time in that role in BSHHD.
Yeah.
Why was it that a UK-wide body was instituted in that sense, for considering further testing, in particular HIV testing?
I can't remember, I'm sorry, and although some of the documents that you've provided deal with the creation of that body, they don't, as far as I remember, say why. But in passing, I would say that this is an example of an advisory body, which I alluded to earlier when I was discussing the relationship between England and Scotland, an advisory body which spans the border. And Archie McIntyre's email about the research proposal, which we were looking at a moment ago, refers to another such body, the name of which I can't remember, but that's just two examples of what I was alluding to earlier.
Do you have any insight as to why it was that it wasn't until April 1989 that the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety?
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I don't.
I'm going to move on then from a question of testing.
Could I, before you do, take
yes.
you to the conclusions of Lord Penrose's inquiry, which looked, obviously from an entirely Scottish angle, at the events surrounding surrogate testing, because it was an important topic.
Have you got a particular paragraph?
Yeah, hold on a sec. I think the key one is on page 103 of chapter 27 of Lord Penrose's final report. I can give you the paragraph reference if you would prefer that.
Can we try, please, PRSE? There may be some issue about precise page numbers, but I'm sure we can find it. PRSE 305070, page 103.
I propose to read out that paragraph, if that's okay.
Which paragraph is it, please?
Paragraph 27.415. So it's not a long paragraph. I'll manage to read it quite quickly. May I?
No, please go ahead.
The inquiry, that is Lord Penrose's inquiry, does not attribute blame for the fact that surrogate testing was not introduced. Given the diversity of respected medical and scientific views over the period 1986 to 91, there was no consistent support for the procedure on tenable scientific or medical grounds that would have made it possible to conclude that officials, that's me and my colleagues, should have recommended the introduction of ALT testing, or that the question was so narrowly balanced that it required to be referred to ministers for decision. It seems to me that that is quite an authoritative conclusion, briefly expressed on the basis of a great deal of research on this matter that Lord Penrose's inquiry carried out.
And in your view, do you think that it was, if we separate both two issues out: the substantive decision and the process behind that decision. In your view, looking back now, having the benefit of the papers and Lord Penrose's report, do you have any regrets about the course that you took?
That sort of question of hindsight, I have no particular views on. I think it's salutary to look at the to look at the conclusion of Lord Penrose, who looked at it in a dispassionate way at these matters, with the benefit of hindsight.
Lawrence, thank you. We can take that down now, please. I'm going to move on, unless there are any other observations you would like to make about surrogate testing. There are a few topics now. All of them will be relatively brief, partly because your involvement in them was relatively brief, or in some instances because everything has been set out either in your witness statement or in Lord Penrose's report, or both. The first concerns financial support, the instigation of the Macfarlane Trust and then the settlement of the HIV litigation. Now, in your witness statement at page 50, paragraph 77.1, you say in effect that you don't recall anything about the topic, the papers haven't helped you, and that the Home and Health Department division concerned with HIV and AIDS took the lead on that question. So is it right to understand that your personal involvement in these matters was really very limited?
I don't recall my personal involvement, and I deduce that it was limited, yes.
Are you able to assist us in understanding what role the SHHD as a whole played in overseeing or funding the Macfarlane Trust?
I'm sorry, I don't recall the topic at all.
On the HIV litigation, we do have 1 minute from you, which is at SCGV 40229_052. And it is a minute that was sent to Mr. Forsyth that time, sorry, it is dated 15th of February 1989, to Mr. Forsyth, I think would still have been the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Scottish Office. And it refers to a Daily Record article dated the 6th of January 1989, which was entitled "You Gave Us AIDS." The reason for the minute is explained in paragraph 1. The Minister requested advice on the Daily Record article. A little background is given at paragraphs 2 and 3 about a series of articles on the campaign for compensation and financial support, and reference is made to the establishment of the Macfarlane Trust in November 1987. And then at point 4 it says this: in an attempt to gain further compensation, some of the 75 haemophiliacs in Scotland who are HIV positive have raised actions in the Court of Session alleging negligence by the NHS. Just on that paragraph, do you know where the figure of 75 would have come from?
I'm afraid not.
Fair to surmise, though, that as you're providing this to the Minister, you would have done your best at the time to ascertain how many there were.
I will have done. Also, although I see that in paragraph 6, I got the number of summonses wrong by 2, and Rab Panton, who worked for me, has corrected it to 13 from 11. So I will have done my best. I may not have been successful.
But obviously, other colleagues would have looked at this submission going up as well, and it's fair to say that 75 was the best figure that you and your colleagues had at the time.
I imagine so.
If we go to paragraph 5, the haemophiliacs allege that the factor VIII, the blood clotting agent used to treat them, was contaminated with the AIDS virus. a batch of factor VIII manufactured before blood donations were screened for HIV infection has since proved to have been contaminated. The case is made out against the Health Board, the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service and the Secretary of State. The case against the Secretary of State alleges that he failed to fulfil his statutory duties by not taking steps to prevent the infection of haemophiliacs. Their main argument is that factor VIII should not have been used after 1984. Now, on that paragraph, the reference to a batch of factor VIII manufactured, does that suggest that at the time you and your colleagues thought that only a single batch of PFC produced factor VIII had caused the infections in Scotland?
Yes.
The following paragraph you've mentioned, the 13 summonses have been issued, all had been sisted, which means stayed or suspended at the time. 5 pending granting of legal aid, and others while information is gathered by the suer's solicitors. And 7, we are working with the solicitor's office to prepare defences on behalf of the Secretary of State. Do you know what work was undertaken by way of factual inquiry by the SHHD into the underlying facts of the case and the question of whether or not the treatment that had been provided, the steps taken, have been appropriate or reasonable or adequate?
I'm afraid I don't.
Are you able to say whether or not you played any role in such an inquiry?
The fact that I use the first person plural in opening paragraph 7 suggests that I was involved, but I don't recollect it. It wouldn't have been unreasonable for me to be involved. It's a serious matter, and it wouldn't have been improper for me to be involved, but I don't recall it.
And it probably goes from or you can probably work out the answer from what you've said before, but do you remember the role played by Dr. Cash in preparing the
no, we would have certainly asked the SNBTS for the factual information necessary to put together the defences on behalf of the Secretary of State. We would have certainly asked the SNBTS. Probably we would have routed it through John Cash, but I don't recall doing so.
I think we've probably taken that as far as we can do there. Do you remember anybody ever raising with you the prospect of a public inquiry, either in Scotland or
No, not at that time. Obviously, Lord Penrose's inquiry was launched about a decade ago, but not in 1987 or 88 or whatever it was.
Do you have any insight or any view about why it was that the prospect of a public inquiry wasn't raised?
Was not raised?
Yes.
It would have been...
I think that may be a very difficult question to answer because it's asking about a negative, which depends on so many other people. However, I think if we can ask a question about the facts rather than speculation about reasons, it may be more helpful to me.
Let's turn then to the question of the procurement of the English and Welsh product 8Y that was produced at BPL, the heat-treated product produced there, as opposed to the heat-treated product that was produced at the PFC at the time. Now, were you aware in 1986 or 1987 that there was a product that was being produced in England and Wales that was thought to have a better effect against non-A, non-B hepatitis?
I will have been aware because it was a very important matter and my normal communication with the SNBTS would have brought it to my attention. But I don't recall that.
Would your source of knowledge have been via the SNBTS then?
Oh yes. From whom else would I learn it? I had no direct contact with the English blood transfusion folk. And it's very unlikely that the Department of Health would have said it. No, the SNBTS would have undoubtedly been the source, either directly or mediated through John Forrester or Archie McIntyre.
Would this then have been one of those incidents that we spoke about before lunch, that if somebody sitting on a pan-UK body had found out about this and wished to raise it with the SHHD, then a door would have been found through which that information could pass?
I don't know, but your question implies that you have to be sitting on a body before you learn things. I would have thought that it was more natural for the blood, whatever it is, the BPL folk, to say to their colleagues in Scotland, "Hey, look, we're getting on better than we expected, or we're getting on quite well with the development of a heat-treated product, the advent of which we were all keenly awaiting."
Were you ever made aware that there have been people in Scotland who have become infected with hepatitis C, non-A, non-B, as it may have been known at the time, through the use of a Scottish blood product when a safer English blood product was available?
The first part of your question, was I aware that folk had been infected with NA and B? The answer to that is yes. I don't think the link with the second was quite so clear. I recall nothing of that kind, and I don't think the papers that you have, let me see, illuminate that. There will certainly be in Lord Penrose's researches an authoritative answer to that question.
But it's not an issue that you recall being brought to your attention?
No.
You say in your statement that it wasn't the role of the SHHD to obtain supplies of HY or any other blood product. That was for individual clinicians. I wonder if you could just expand on why that was so.
Okay. So far, the individual patient had no interface with the Scottish Home and Health Department. The interface for the individual patient was with his or her clinician. For example, Chris Ludlam, who's given evidence to you. What Chris Ludlam would have done, well, it would be better to ask Chris Ludlam that question, because I'm retailing second-hand information or deducing what Chris Ludlam would have done. I don't know that I can add usefully to what I've already said in written evidence.
I think the question was actually not directed at the clinician. It was directed to the Scottish Home and Health Department's activities, and you were asked, could you expand on why it wasn't for the SHHD to obtain supplies of a product which probably was better capable of eliminating hepatitis non-A, non-B from recipients, and making it available for those in Scotland who might want to use it. That's the question. So it's not directed to the clinician, it's directed to the supplier.
Yes, right. I follow. Thanks for the redirection. I was trying to go back too far. So far as I'm aware, SHHD acquired no pharmaceutical products for prescription to to patients. It wasn't the way that the system worked. Now, I say that slightly tentatively because it wasn't my area of responsibility. It was a matter for Graham Calder, the chief pharmacist, but I can recall no pharmaceutical product of any kind which was procured by the Scottish Home and Health Department.
Was there any role for the SHHD or the chief pharmacist or indeed the chief medical officer in overseeing or giving advice to clinicians about the type of product that they should be using?
I can recall nothing contemporaneously, but something in the mound of documents that you've provided me with. There is a statement by, I think, Ian MacDonald, which said that it would probably be Ian's testimony to the Penrose inquiry or the extract from the report of the Penrose inquiry commenting on Ian MacDonald's evidence, which said that he would have been very unwilling to override the clinical judgment of people like Chris Ludlam and require them to prescribe a particular product. Now, the general policy of SHHD as regards blood products was that we tried very hard to make sure that the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service was able to meet any request for a blood or a blood product from a clinician. But we drew back. And the reason for that was that we felt that it was A, safer, and B, cheaper than buying product in. But we constantly drew back, our medics constantly drew back from trying to dictate that solution to their clinical colleagues in the health boards.
That presumably goes for commercial products generally as well as 8Y.
Indeed.
Right?
Yes, yes. Indeed, I suspect that it was much more directed to commercial products than the product called 8Y, which, if my memory of the documents that you've provided me with serves me right, was very hard to get hold of because the BPL production was not sufficient to meet English needs, never mind administered to Scottish patients. So I remember seeing a reference to Chris Ludlam having acquired, really on the old boys' net, a small quantity of a product which I think was 8Y for giving to one of his patients. But that was, he was, I think, he regarded himself very fortunate to have been able to do that. It wasn't an easy matter of whistling up a lorry load of 8Y.
Do you think the SHHD would have been in a better place to do that than Dr. Ludlam and his colleagues at the old boys?
No, because it wasn't the way we operated at all. It would have been a very unusual thing to do.
Let me turn briefly to the compensation and indemnity arrangements for the Z8 trials. This is dealt with in your statement at section 50, and you also make reference to the relevant chapter of Lord Penrose's report, I think chapter 24 on this. I'm not going to go through it in detail. It appears that the issue is a concern expressed principally by Dr. Ludlam about the provisions for compensation for patients who suffered adverse effects in the trials of Z8. It was raised for several years, not in respect of Z8 more generally, with the SHHD before you joined, raised with you personally in December 1986 and January 1987, by which stage there was an acute risk, as it were, that it could delay the trials. And you then stepped in, made arrangements, and it seems we're able to resolve at least the initial part of it fairly quickly. And then a wider scheme was introduced later that autumn. Now, from your knowledge of the time and from the papers you saw both at the time and since, are you able to say why it was that such a scheme hadn't been introduced before your intervention?
Yes. It was because it was a difficult nut to crack. You asked earlier about whether Treasury approval was necessary to fund surrogate testing, and my answer to that was no. That was not one of the areas of our work that required specific Treasury approval. But the issue of compensation payments to anyone an agreement to make a payment in an insurance sort of way did require specific Treasury approval. So it wasn't something that one often did. It was rather unusual and potentially difficult. Secondly, the issue initially was complicated by confusion about exactly what it was, exactly what circumstance Chris Ludlam wanted compensation triggered. And I should explain that it wasn't that compensation, that patients were infected and eligible for compensation. It was Chris's fear that they might be harmed by the non-therapeutic use of the product in clinical trials. As far as I know, nobody was harmed, and the compensation scheme which we set up was never needed. So it was a little difficult to pin down exactly what Chris Ludlam wanted compensated for. And before my time in SHHD, my colleagues, or my future colleagues, asked the CSA to come up with a scheme. That wasn't a ridiculous request, because the CSA not only had the blood transfusion service, therefore more conscious than the department about the circumstances in which compensation might be called for, but also the Central Legal Office, which had an understandable knowledge of the legal aspects of compensation schemes. However, I think because it wasn't an urgent matter and it was a difficult matter, nothing seemed to have been done, or a grasp was never taken of the issue until Chris Ludlam gave his ultimatum. I won't try the product on patients until this compensation scheme is in effect. Once that ultimatum had been issued and the matter narrowed down to a particular point in the trialling of products, I got a grip of it. It was easy to resolve. Treasury approved it very quickly, and the conclusion of Lord Penrose's inquiry was that the start to the clinical trials was perhaps slightly postponed by a matter of weeks, but the trials were completed before the product was ready for application to patients, so no time was in the end lost. But it wasn't the most sparkling example of departmental administration, and that is the reason for it. It was a complicated matter which required Treasury approval. It didn't appear urgent until Chris Ludlam's ultimatum.
Just finally on this point, I've been asked to raise this with you. The reference in your statement is to the different stages of the trials, and there is a stage which is referred to in your statement as the non-therapeutic stage. Now, I've been asked to clarify what is meant by that. Is that providing the product to people who didn't need it, or is that something to do with the stages of a trial?
It's both. At the start of testing the effectiveness of the new product, Chris Ludlam wanted to be sure that it had the effect on the haemophiliac patient that was desired, that it would have the necessary effect on stopping a bleed. The patients on whom he tried it were not in therapeutic need of that product, so were particularly public-spirited in agreeing to be part of the trial, and so were, one could argue, particularly meritorious for compensation if something went wrong. But as the second part of your question implies, that was only the first stage of a series of trials which looked at not only the efficacy but also the safety of the product. And I think Chris Ludlam had, well, no, it's hard to tell. The bottom line was that we eventually covered all the stages of the trial, but it was useful to have started with the bit where the recipient patient didn't need the product, because that was the case that was most worthy of sympathy in the eyes of Treasury, whose approval we needed.
It was also, was it not, the first stage of the trial, so it was going to be the bit that came earliest and the bit that needed to be sorted out first.
Yes, that's right.
Did you understand that to be standard practice for a clinical trial of a drug?
No, it was, I think, exceptional. We based the compensation on ABPI, Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, guidelines. So it must have been precedented, but I think it was very unusual, which is why we had to break the ground with a blood product, which is a slightly out of the ordinary pharmaceutical product.
You said that the individuals who took part in that trial were particularly public-spirited because they agreed to do it. So you would have expected fully informed consent to have been taken from those individuals.
Yes, and that was the point, I think, that Chris Ludlam was most worried about. He found it hard, and one can understand it, and I understood it at the time. He found it hard to recommend to patients that they participate with no safety net of compensation if something went wrong. In the unlikely event that something went wrong, and as I've said, nothing did in fact go wrong.
The SHHD was obviously involved in the indemnity side of it. Would the consent side of it have been left to Dr. Ludlam?
Yes, indeed.
Finally, just two final points. The first is a point which was raised by, among others, Lady Hooper in her evidence, a former Department of Health minister. She made the point that she felt that there wasn't a sufficient amount of consultation with individuals who were infected and affected directly between ministers and those individuals. From your perspective, do you remember meeting and discussing the situation with people who were infected and affected?
No, not at all. I had, in part of my responsibility for services for physically disabled people, I had a lot of contact with patients. Other than that, I had none, because the department, unlike services for physically disabled patients, the department wasn't the provider. The provider in this case was first the haemophiliac directors like Chris Ludlam, and behind them, the SNBTS. The department was one step further behind, and there would have been no locus for the department to have direct contact with patients. Patients' representatives was a bit of a different kettle of fish. The Haemophilia Society, I remember, was energetic and knowledgeable in contacting the department. The mountain of papers that you've provided me with contained a couple of bits of correspondence of that kind, but that wasn't quite the direct contact with individual patients that Gloria Hooper was referring to.
And finally, this, in that period that you were at VSHHD, in that role of 1986 to 1989, do you think that there was an awareness of the impact of what had happened on people who were infected and who had been affected by the tragedy?
Yes, absolutely. Particularly, remember that the department collectively had been through the HIV infection from blood products, where the testimony of patients, the public profile of patients was very high. And I think the public sympathy for these patients, particularly hemophiliac patients who had expected to be made better by the blood products that were administered to them, the sympathy for these patients was widespread in the department.
Those are the questions that I have for you, Dr. Macniven. There will now be an opportunity for call participants to put some questions for you, and I'll hand back to the chair to explain that.
Yes, well, at this stage of proceedings, the core participants who represented by the recognised legal representatives have a right through those representatives to put questions to counsel for him to ask you in turn. And plainly, they will have listened to what you've been saying. They have to be given a chance to think about what they might want to ask and then invite counsel to ask them. So we have to give them some time. And what I propose, how long do you think you might need, Mr. Hill?
Could I ask for half an hour, sir?
Yes, certainly. It is, for safety's sake, as it were, we will say no earlier than 5 to 4. So it's no earlier than 5 to 4. It may be later, if so you'll be told. And how long you're detained after that, it really depends how many questions there are.
My train back is tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock.
I think you may be done by then.
Thank you.
So 5 to 4.